Now I write this. This is a matrix, this is a row, this is a row. I've got a little line here, and that line has a purpose that you'll see very shortly, okay? What this means is 2x plus 1y equals 1. The first number in a row is multiplied by x. The second number is multiplied by y, and we add those. And this line here indicates there's an equal sign, and this is on the other side, this number's on the other side of the equal. Well, you should now pause and write down what you think this line means, or at least think it in your head. And hopefully you've done that, because I'm not going to stop and wait for you. Actually, I'll write it this way. Okay, 1x plus 1y equals 2. Now, we don't have to write the 1 in front of x. We could just say, okay, this is 2x plus y equals 1, and x plus y equals 2. Now, I want this to match the equations that we started with last time. And I kind of screwed up. I had a negative 2x in front. Well, I had a negative 2x, right? So what would I change here to make this match this system? Well, hopefully you've got an answer, because you don't want to wait for me to tell you. Obviously, I should have a negative 2 in front of x, right? And that means I better have a negative 2 here. So now my system matches the system I had before. Okay, now we're going to solve the system without ever writing down our x's or y's. Okay, what I want to do first is I want to change things so that I have a 1 here. What could I do to make this into a 1 that's equivalent to things that I would do to an equation? Well, I could multiply this first row, because the first row just corresponds to an equation, right? I can multiply every term in the equation by any number I want, as long as it isn't 0. So I can multiply every number in this row by anything I want, and it'll represent an equation that's equivalent to the first one, to this one. So what do I have to multiply by negative 2 to get 1? Well, we want 1 in the first position of the first row. So multiply the first row by negative 1/2. Well, we don't have to write out a bunch of equations to do that. We just do negative 1/2 of negative 2. What's that? 1. Okay, well, you should pause for a minute and multiply negative 1/2 by 1 and negative 1/2 by this 1. And write them down where they're going to go. Where are they going to go? Well, first of all, negative 1/2 times 1 is negative 1/2. And negative 1/2 times 1 is negative 1/2. Now, we haven't done anything to the second row. We don't want to confuse the issue by trying to do two things, to do things to two different rows. So we're just going to repeat the second row. We're only going to change one row at a time. Sometimes you get away with doing more than that. We don't want to. Okay? Now what? Well, the next thing we want, we got our 1 here, and we're never going to change that. We never want that 1 to change. But what we want is we want to get a 0 here, so I'm going to circle that 0. Now, if we have a 1 here, we're going to have the negative 1/2 and the negative 1/2. In other words, we have the whole first row if we have any part of it. Okay? But now the second row is going to have to change. Now, we know that we can add any multiple of any row to any other row and replace either row. Okay? In other words, we can add any multiple of one equation to any multiple of the other and replace whichever equation we want to replace. And we're pretty familiar with that. So it turns out that it's pretty easy to figure out how we can get a 0 here. If we just add -1 times the first row to the second row, we're going to have a -1 here to add to the 1, right? Okay, so a -1 here added to 1 gives us 0. Well, then we're going to have -1 times this added to this, and -1 times this added to this, right? So we want 0 in the first position of the second row. Okay? Our rows are 1, -1/2, -1/2, and 1, 1, 2. So I'm going to say we multiply the first row by -1. We want to do that off to the side someplace. This is just scratch. None of this, except the final result, is going to appear anywhere in here. The only thing that's going to appear in here is our final result when we do this, okay? So we multiply the first by -1, and we get -1 plus 1/2 plus 1/2. Okay, so that's our first row. Now we don't change it over here. We're just using this to calculate what happened, how to calculate the result that's going to give us a 0 here in the second row. And so then we write our second row, 1, 1, 2. So multiply the first by -1 and add to the second, and we get what? -1, I'm sorry, the second row, it doesn't, well, that was a dash, there's the second, okay? A -1 and a 1 adds up to 0, there we got it. And now we've just got to take whatever we get from the rest of the calculation. Well, 1/2 and 1 is 3/2, 1/2 and 2 is 5/2. These numbers are probably familiar if you've got a decent memory for numbers, and if you don't, well, a lot of people don't. Okay? So there's no reason you should feel bad if you don't remember, but okay. And really, you probably shouldn't try to remember. Okay, do we understand what we've done? We wanted a 0 here. Here's our first row, here's our second row. What can we do to get a 0 here? We can multiply the first row by -1, and then add that to the second row, and we're going to get a 0 here. Okay, now what next? Well, the next thing we want, we've got our 1 here and our 0 here. We want to get 1 here. This is what we're after. So we want I'll write this as we want 1 in the second row, second column. And how do we achieve that? Well, we have 3/2 in the second row, second column. We can multiply any equation by any number except 0 and get an equivalent equation. So, do the same thing to a row, because a row just represents an equation. So we multiply second row by 2/3. Because we have a 3/2, if we take 2/3 of 3/2, we get 1. So 2/3 of 0, of course, is going to give us 0. 2/3 of 3/2 is going to give us our 1. That's why we're doing 2/3. And we got 2/3. Let's write it out carefully. 2/3 times 5/2, right? Okay. That's 2/3 times the second row. 2/3 times the row, 0, 3/2, 5/2. And actually, I'd probably designate that row with brackets because it's a matrix in itself. Okay, that's not important. So this is just 2/3 of the second row. And of course, if we simplify this, we get 0. 2/3 of 3/2 is 6/6, which reduces to 1. And 2/3 of 5/2 is 10/6, which reduces to 5/3. So this number gives us 0, this number gives us 1, this number gives us 5/3. The important thing is that this gave us the 1 that we were looking for here, and now we have the 5/3 here. Now the first row hasn't been changed, still got the 1 here, and the rest of the numbers, okay? But there's one last thing we need to do. We now want to change the first row to get a 0 here. We're not going to change the second row, it's still going to be this, but we're going to want to get 1 and a 0 here. And then something here. Now often I'll indicate a something that we have to fill in with a couple of asterisks. You'll see that in some of the materials I'm giving you. How are we going to get a 0 here, though? We don't worry about those asterisks. They'll come right out of our calculation, you'll see. How can we get a 0 here? We've got this, and we've got to get 0 here. What can we do? Well, if I add half of the second row to the first, I'm going to have half of 1 here. That's going to be a half. If I add a half to negative half, what do I get? I get 0. So it looks like I'm going to have to add half of the second row to the first. So I'm going to write this out. We want 0 in the first row, first column. So add 1/2 of the second row to the first. Okay, so the first row is 1, negative 1/2, negative 1/2. The second row is 0, 1, 5/3, but I'm going to take half of each one of these because this is going to give me half. And of course I'll take half of 0 too. We don't want to leave it out. Okay? So that gives me 1, negative 1/2, negative 1/2, 0, 1/2, 5/6. Now I can add these. Okay? 1 and 0 gives me 1. Negative 1/2 and 1/2 gives me 0. Negative 1/2 and 5/6 gives me 1/3. And you can work out the fractions there. Okay? So, and this is going to replace the first row. So I've got the 1, I've got the 0. If I get a 1 and a 0 in the first row, I'm going to have a 1/3 over here. So the only thing I still got to fill in to match that, I just got to put the 1/3 there. So there was our 2 asterisks. Now, 2 asterisks just indicate there's a number that goes here. We don't yet know what it is. As soon as we know what it is, we put it in there and get rid of the asterisk. Okay, so here it is. Now, what equation is this equivalent to? See if you can write that down for yourself. I'm going to have to stop the video here because we're almost up to a limit. And we'll continue in the next video and see what all this means and where it fits in.